Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name's Tony Eld, I'm the Director of the National Gallery Victoria, and I'd like to welcome you to this virtual curatorial tour of our recent exhibition, Goya, Drawings from the Prado Museum. Firstly though, I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional owners of the land in which the NGV is built, the Wurundjeri and the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. While many of you weren't able to visit Goya Drawings from the Prado Museum in person, we are fortunate to be able to launch our virtual exhibition tour with you today. You'll be joined by the NGV's Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings, Cathy, and our Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings, Jessica Cole, who will guide you through on a curatorial tour. The exhibition itself features more than 160 works on paper by Francisco Goya, celebrating the artist's extraordinary imagination. Goya is actually considered to be one of the first truly modern artists. In humorous observations, confronting depictions of violence, and surreal flights of fantasy, he presents a vision of humanity that had no equivalent in the art of his day. Before we start, I wanted to thank you all for your support of the NGV. The NGV is extremely grateful for the support of our corporate partners, without whom this exhibition wouldn't be possible. But we're also very grateful for the generosity and time and expertise of the staff of the Prado Museum, especially their Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings, Jose Manuel Matilla. And importantly, thank you to you, our NGV community, for tuning in today and for your outstanding support of the gallery. We can't wait to welcome you back soon. But I'd now like to welcome Cathy and Jessica to begin the tour. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you enjoy the tour.
Hello and welcome. I'm Cathy Leahy and I'm joined today by my colleague Jess Cole to take you on this virtual tour of Goya, Drawings from the Prado Museum. As we take you through the tour, what you'll see on your screen is an interactive floor plan of the exhibition. It's comprised of over 300 individual 360-degree view images, and these have been stitched together using hardware and software similar to Google Earth. The NGV has used this newly developed technology to document our exhibitions, which of course has been extremely useful in this recent period of lockdown. We're going to move into the gallery space now. And in this first gallery, we begin the exhibition with this self-portrait that Goya made in 1798 when he was around 52 years of age. And it is the frontispiece to the Los Caprichos series of etchings. By this date, Goya was 52 years of age, and he was the most celebrated artist in Spain. He was court painter to the Spanish kings, and he was director of painting at the Royal Academy. And he was highly sought after for his portrait paintings and his religious paintings as well. But only a few years prior to making this etching, Goya had suffered a near fatal illness, and that left him permanently and profoundly deaf. And this is a real turning point in his life and in his art, and has been credited with a kind of turning inward by the artist to his innermost imagination and thoughts. It was while he was recuperating that Goya really turned to drawing for the first time as an autonomous medium. He had made drawings previously in relation to tapestries and paintings, where they're kind of technical drawings where he's working out the composition. But it's the first time following his illness that he really addresses drawing as a kind of a medium through which he can give voice to his innermost thoughts and dreams and visions. So Goya made over 900 drawings during his lifetime, which he kept in 8 albums, and these albums are lettered A to H. The albums are no longer intact, but nearly half of these drawings belong to the Prado Museum in Madrid. They have the greatest collection. So they're the album drawings, but there are also drawings that Goya executed as preparatory works for his etchings, and we have a large component of that type of drawing in the exhibition as well. So unlike his paintings, Goya's drawings were not commissioned by patrons. Rather, they were private works through which he recorded his observations and his thoughts, as well as giving free rein to his imagination. So we're now going to move to look at the earliest drawing in the exhibition. And you'll notice that it's positioned here in a freestanding blade or a wall, and that's because it's double-sided. In the first of Goya's albums, he worked on both sides of the sheet. It's only a very tiny album, the first album, Album A, and the images, there are only 9 double-sided sheets. They show images of women, women brushing their hair, washing themselves, or as here, as I'm showing you, a woman reclining on a bed. And they were originally thought to represent women engaged in everyday activities, although more recent research now considers that a number of them allude to prostitution. And we're going to turn now to the side wall to have a look at a drawing from Goya's next album, Album B, which is a really important album for him. It dates from around 1796 to 7, just a couple of years after Album A, and it shows a rapid development in the artist's ideas. You can still see many images of women and small groups of people, but what we begin to see in this album is a new element of social critique or commentary that appears in the drawings, and many of the drawings become the basis for the series of satirical etchings, Los Caprichos, that also feature here in this gallery. And Goya was working on the Caprichos series from about 1797 to 8, and he published it early in 1799. It's a very important series, the Los Caprichos, and maybe we'll turn to the next, the side wall, where we can see one of the related print to this drawing. The Caprichos series comprises 80 plates, and in it Goya satirised human foibles and critiqued the social and political corruption that was rife in contemporary Spain, as well as things like ignorance and superstition. And his interest in these issues reflected the attitudes of the Ilustrados, the enlightened writers, philosophers and statesmen in whose circle he moved in both court and in society. And by the late 18th century, Spain was still steeped in superstition and governed by anachronistic laws and moral codes. And the Ilustrados were trying to modernise the country through wide-ranging social, religious, educational and other types of reforms. And one of the issues that really was of great concern to the Ilustrados was the position of women, and the prevalence of prostitution and issues like marriage of convenience were issues of great concern. And we see that subject being addressed by Goya in these early drawings and also in the Caprichos, and certainly also in this drawing. Here, what we see, as you can see, very closely related to the Album B drawing, but here we see the young dandy who leans in closely to examine the Maya, who's dressed in kind of Spanish dress. And he's holding a magnifying glass up so that he can examine her more closely. But even this doesn't help him to identify her true identity, which is that she is a sex worker. So Goya here in this image is critiquing, this young man's lack of experience and her false coquetry. And so in doing so, he kind of highlights issues such as deception and gullibility in relations between men and women. And courtship rituals and the relations between men and women are important elements that Goya addresses in the series. I'm going to hand over to Jess now, who's going to talk to us about some more works in the Caprichos series.
Thanks, Cathy. So we're going to move now to the opposite wall in this gallery, where we see a different type of drawing. This is the first, one of the first preparatory drawings for the Los Caprichos. So it didn't come from an album. It was specifically made as a preparatory drawing for the print. And so Goya made preparatory drawings for all of his Caprichos etchings, and usually in red chalk, as here. And some of these give us a fascinating insight into the artist's actual working process. So he used them to, in fact, transfer his design onto the etching plate. By placing the drawing face down onto the plate and running both through the press. And then this is a great example in which you can actually see the plate mark impression on the edge of the paper. So it was the pressure of the press that transferred the red chalk outlines of the drawing onto the sticky ground of the etching plate. And from there, Goya could then further work up the drawing with his etching needle. And this, of course, meant that the drawing and the final print were the same orientation. So sometimes the images of the drawings compared with the prints are almost identical, as here, and in other instances, he made significant changes to the composition on the etching plate. The subject of this rather amusing print is a brothel scene where the sex workers sweep away their spent clients, which are pictured as pitiful, naked birdmen who've been plucked of all their money to make way for the next in line. The title of the print is "There They Go Plucked." And this is one of many examples of how Goya uses caricature to express human moral degradation. And just moving along the wall, we come to another example of Goya's use of caricature, and this time we're back into his album drawings in a drawing called Merry Caricature. And as his albums were, of course, private, Goya was able to give free rein to his views, many of which were anti-clerical, as in the case here. And here he's using grotesque distortion to great effect. So the drawing, which he titled, there's an inscription at the bottom, which he titled himself Merry Caricature. He depicts a group of monks shoveling food into their mouths. And the figure on the left, as I'm sure you can see, has an enormous phallic nose, which is so big that it requires a prop. And this is an album drawing that in fact became the basis for a print in the Caprichos. Many of the drawings, particularly in this album, which is album B, became the basis for Caprichos prints. The name of which is They Are Hot, or Están Calientes in Spanish. And if we switch to the print, you can see that Goya watered down his inflammatory depiction because indictment by the Inquisition for heresy was still a very real risk at this time. And it was probably this that caused him to withdraw the Los Caprichos from sale only 2 days after it was advertised. And instead, you can see here in the print that Goya has emphasized the monks' gaping mouths to suggest that they have an insatiable appetite. However, the allusion to lust from the drawing is still maintained in the title, Están Calientes, because calientes meant one ignited by passions or an animal on heat. So we'll move now down through to the back wall of the gallery, where we see a group of drawings and prints that deal with the subject of poor education. Reform of childhood education preoccupied progressive thinkers in Spain and is reflected in numerous prints and drawings by Goya. This print, which is called Here Comes the Bogeyman, criticizes the way in which parents instill superstitious beliefs and fear in their children. Goya, writing of this print, "It is a form of lamentable abuse of early education to make a child fear the bogeyman more than his father, and thus make it afraid of something that does not exist." And moving along this wall, we find further images of children being beaten for innocuous wrongs or while doing their lessons, and also even being given over to a life of servitude. And then as we turn the corner, we come to a series of 6 etchings featuring donkeys or asses, which are a symbol of folly and ignorance that was common in Spanish art and literature in Goya's time. Goya uses this form of animal allegory to ridicule various professions. So we see here asses in the guise of doctors, teachers, as well as aristocrats and the clergy. So we're now around halfway through the Caprichos, and here we find at plate 43, Goya's most famous print, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, which Cathy is now going to tell you a bit more about.
Great, thanks, Jess. So while, as we've seen, the first half of Los Caprichos is dedicated to social satires that target, as we've seen, prostitution, poor education, the aristocracy and the clergy, the second half features allegorical images of superstition and ignorance, represented by monstrous creatures and witches. And The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, this most famous print by Goya, introduces this second half of the series. It shows the artist asleep at a desk surrounded by nocturnal owls and bats and watched over by a sharp-eyed lynx. The title of the print, you may not be able to see it there on your screen, but is actually inscribed on the desk front on which the artist is leaning. So the image suggests then the limits of reason, that we only have to be dormant for an instant for the irrational to be unleashed. And as Jess mentioned, it's plate 43 in the series, and so it introduces the remaining 36 prints, which feature fantastic images of witches, goblins, satyrs, and hybrid creatures. And if we move into the back room of this first gallery space, we can see some of these fantastic creatures in these images. And Goya used these monsters produced by the Sleep of Reason to critique superstition, ignorance and human vice. Witches were still widely believed in late 18th century Spain, as were hobgoblins and some other supernatural creatures. And if we just move down to the next drawing here, yes, in this drawing and its related print alongside, we see two novice witches learning their craft of necromancy, and they're learning to fly. You can see they're actually levitating off the ground, and they're watched over by this kind of he-goat. And a goat is a symbol of lust, or of course it's the devil. So contemporary audiences really saw this or interpreted this print as showing young women being instructed in adultery. Alongside this, we see images of witches here, this image of called Blow. It's really using witches as a very savage denunciation of vice and evil behaviour. Here we see a witch using a child as a bellows to fan the flames in a brazier. And this image has been interpreted as a critique of the carnal trade in children. And in the image alongside, pretty teacher, again, we see two witches, one elderly and behind her a very young witch on a broomstick. And in the what we see here, just in the positioning of the very suggestive positioning of the broomstick between the legs, that in fact Goya is making an analogy between the older witch and the procuress, the woman who instructs the younger woman into being a sex worker, into prostitution. And if we just look at some of the other images along this wall, we can see again just the types of creatures that Goya is depicting. And we come to the final group of works here, which actually Goya returns to the theme of the clergy. And it shows three images. These are the last three images in the series. It shows three images of the clergy engaged in deception of various kinds under the cover of darkness. And like monstrous creatures of the night, they must conclude their secretive activities before daybreak. And in this use of darkness as a cover for aberrant behaviour, Goya seems to be making an allusion to ignorance and also to the imminent light of day as being symbolic of the light of reason, which will sweep away such vice and corruption. So with that, we come to the end of the first gallery space and the Caprichos images. And we move through this small area dedicated to an examination of Goya's print techniques. And we move now into the second gallery of the exhibition, where Goya's prints and drawings of the 1810s and 1820s are displayed. The years following the turn of the century became increasingly turbulent in Spain, and in 1808, when Goya was 61 years of age, war broke out in the country when Napoleon invaded and installed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. The Peninsular War raged for 6 long, bloody years and brought on a devastating famine in Madrid in 1811 to 12. The war involved the Spanish army, as well as mercenaries, but also civilians who organised into guerrilla groups. And actually, it's the first time that guerrilla warfare was enacted. And there were atrocities committed on all sides. During this period, Goya turned again to drawing and to printmaking, and from about 1810 he began a new series of etchings made on any scraps of copper that he could find, and of course materials were very difficult to obtain during this period, and so what you see is that some of the images are of differing sizes. The plates aren't all the same. So the Disasters of War series of 80 etchings were made over 5 years, and they are the most radical images of warfare that have been produced to that date, and arguably you could say even since. There is in the series no conventional images of heroic deeds or patriotic martyrs, but rather 80 harrowing images of cruelty, violence and suffering, acts of barbarity, mutilation, executions and rape are all pictured with a new realism, and the series also shows the plight of civilians long after the conflict ceased. There's a new realism that we see in these images that can be seen in the depictions of piles of corpses, which are rendered with a very delicate etched line. But despite their realism, Goya did not see much of the war in person, but rather based his images on stories and reports. And the image in the middle of this screen here is called What Courage, and it depicts a known woman, her name is Augustina Aragon, who loaded and fired cannons to defend the city of Zaragoza in 1808 during its siege. And stories of her bravery circulated wildly. They were reported in the press and actually inspired other images that Goya would have based his image on. As we move along the wall of Disasters of War images, we see images of rape, torture, and mutilation. See that as we move past. And Goya's series also included dramatic staged images, such as this execution scene, which is almost cinematic in its effect. The French soldiers are outside the picture frame here. All we see of them are their rifles pointing towards the blindfolded Spaniard, and which tells us that his death is imminent. In the background, 3 French soldiers are shown in the act of firing, and behind them a further victim awaits his execution. So as in so many of these prints, the scene presents a staged scenario with a great sense of realism. We now move to the last prints in the series, and these were made after the war and after the return of the Spanish king, Ferdinand VII, in 1814. Rather than the longed-for peace, there was the onset of a new era of terrible political repression. Ferdinand reinstated the Inquisition and began severe persecution of liberals. And we see in the final images of the Disasters of War several prints made by Goya that target the church because of its collaboration with the king's absolutist regime. And this drawing here, which is called The Consequences, and it's the drawing for the related print in the series, and it depicts a blood-sucking vampire with a human face. And the face actually bears the features of Pope Pius VII, who is also portrayed in the print to the right, which is called May the Cord Break. And if we just move to look at that print, we see the Pope in the next image. In May the Cord Break, we see the Pope here performing a balancing act on a fraying cord. And this is an allusion that Goya is making to the Pope's collaboration with Ferdinand VII's repressive regime, and also his neglect of his moral duties to the Spanish people. So Goya never actually published the Disasters of War series during his lifetime, and no doubt that was because of this kind of savage condemnation of church and state in it. Would have made the publishing of such a series incredibly dangerous for Goya. And so that they weren't actually published in his lifetime and were only published 35 years after Goya's death in 1863. Going to hand over to Jess now, who's going to tell us about some of the album drawings that Goya was making in these years.
Thank you, Cathy. So in the post-war years, Goya continued in his position as court painter, surviving the purge of court officials who had worked with the French, and also a hearing before the Inquisition. However, he was supplanted in the king's favour by a younger artist and therefore received fewer commissions. And so he turned increasingly to drawing in his private albums again in these years to express his innermost thoughts. And we find a total of 4 albums containing over 300 drawings from this period. The subject matter and the tone of many of these drawings is very dark and reflects these extraordinarily difficult years. They include images of the underprivileged, the mentally unwell, victims of war or persecution, elderly men and women, witches, and other subjects. This drawing of a crippled man bears the ironic title, "This is how useful men, old men usually end up," and may depict a war veteran forgotten by society, or a farmer forced from his land following the war. Moving along, this album also includes images of victims of the Inquisition. This drawing depicts a woman named Orosio Moreno, who was tried for witchcraft, and she's dressed in the Inquisition's penitential garments, including the conical hat. She's the subject of an auto da fe, a public ritual during which accusations against her were read out. And in the title, Goya writes, "I saw her," but scholars disagree on whether he or not he actually witnessed this scene. But we do know that Goya, and this is recorded in his letters, as a young man, he'd witnessed a woman burnt at the stake for being convicted of heresy. Moving on again, in 1816, Goya published a series of prints on the subject of bullfighting, which, despite being his most refined etchings and devoted to a Spanish national pastime, were actually a complete commercial failure. Although Goya had been an aficionado of the bullfight as a young man, by the early 19th century his attitude had changed and was aligned with that of enlightened opinion, which condemned the sport as a barbarous activity. Goya emphasizes the violence of bullfighting in these images, such as this one showing one of the most brutal practices in which the bull was disabled by the severing of his hamstrings before being killed by people on foot. And then in other images, he focuses on the madcap antics of the most famous bullfighters, which Goya saw as reckless and irrational. The danger was not only for the animal, but also for the spectators in the stands. And the bullfighters, the final image shows the death of the famous bullfighter Pepe Illo. And Goya made one further series of etchings in these repressive post-war years, which are now known as the disparates, which translates loosely as follies or absurdities. And these are some of the most difficult etchings Goya created to interpret. They were made sometime between 1815 and 1819 and are often linked to Goya's so-called black paintings, which were an extraordinary series of murals that he painted on the walls of his villa in the outskirts of Madrid. The images have a nightmarish quality with no distinction between reality and dream. Moving on slightly to one of the prints, a couple of the prints from the series, we can see that several have themes that relate to Carnival, that festival season when social rules and conventions are abandoned. Other prints return to themes or figures from the Caprichos, but the moralizing tone of the earlier works are now grotesque. Disorderly Folly, for example, shows a mismatched couple fused together from head to torso in a loveless union and tormented by a crowd of monstrous features. Moving along the wall slightly, we arrive at the preparatory drawing for Merry Folly. And as you can see, the preparatory drawings for the Disparates are very freely drawn in brush and red wash, like in this wonderfully energetic example, which depicts three young women dancing in a circle with three older, grotesque men who lurch in an uncoordinated way. Goya used wet and dry brushes to achieve a sense of movement and texture that is removed in the etching, which is much darker, emphasizing the incompatibility of the men and the women. Like the Disasters of War, the Disparates series were not published until 35 years after Goya's death, and he in fact didn't even complete it, leaving the plates packed up in a box in his villa when he went into self-imposed exile in Bordeaux. So I'll now hand over back to Cathy, who's going to just address these final years of Goya's life and of the exhibition.
Thanks, Jess. And the exhibition finishes with a magnificent group of 6 drawings that date from the last 4 years of Goya's life, which he spent in France, in the southern city of Bordeaux. The repressive crackdown on liberals from 1823 was so great that Goya went into hiding for 3 months in Madrid. And then, after an amnesty for the liberals was declared, Goya sought permission from the king to take the waters in France. And with the king's permission, he left Spain in June 1824. In fact, he never did go to take the waters in France. Rather, he arrived in Bordeaux when he was 78 years of age and settled there where there was an émigré Spanish community. And these last 4 years of his life in Bordeaux were extraordinarily productive ones, in which Goya threw himself into several new projects and learnt new techniques, including mastering lithography, which was a very new print technique at that stage. He was also very active in making drawings, and he made over 200 drawings, all executed in a greasy crayon, which was a new medium for the artist and perhaps related to his experience of lithography. And these drawings are held in 2 albums, Album G and Album H. And they depict disturbing, absurd and humorous satires. And it's been speculated that Goya was planning a new series of Caprichos prints and that some of these drawings may have been related to this. And this drawing that showing you here depicts a carnivalesque figure. It's known as Phantom, dancing with castanets. He holds castanets in his hands. And he has a certain kinship to one of the carnival figures that Jess showed you in the Disparates wall, the Babalicon, this oversized buffoon. But here, Goya dresses this figure in monk's robes, and he dances in a clumsy, sort of lewd fashion. He has this leering smile that makes him slightly sinister and grotesque figure. The next drawing introduces a very different mood, as it is a beautiful study in pathos. It's titled by Goya, Literate Animal, and it shows a cat-like creature holding a book in its paws. The animal looks out at the viewer as it is egged on in its pointless exercise of trying to read by this kind of grinning figure over its shoulder who wields a stick. And the creature's expression is one of resignation and humiliation, and one that's really very deeply moving, I think. And the next drawing, and the last one that I will talk to you about today, returns us to Goya's fascination with dreams, nightmares, states of fear and madness. It was titled by Goya Bad Dream, and in it you can see a man screaming in terror at the apparition before him of a free-floating head that's being attacked by a flock of birds. The man's horror is very real, and I think that's really powerfully expressed in the drawing. His hair stands on end and his mouth is open and his hand is kind of opened in alarm. Yet the nature of the apparition suggests that what we are witnessing here is an episode of madness. It's a very equally compelling and disturbing image by Goya. So what these drawings show, these last drawings reveal that Goya's powers of invention remained undiminished at the end of his long life, and they're just this wonderful conclusion to our exhibition. And Goya's drawings remain his most remarkable works, and they bear witness to his astonishing powers of observation and invention, through which he expressed a vision of humanity that was unprecedented in his own time, and really that remains relevant to today.
Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed your virtual visit. And thanks again to our corporate partners, and in particular, the Museo del Prado in Madrid, and especially to Jose Manuel Matilla, Senior Curator of Drawings and Prints at the Prado. We look forward to welcoming you back to the gallery soon.